years ago, I was surrounded here on Sea Hill. The spot-tail fire came down this hill in 2006, burning everything in its path, and it was stopped by those football fields over there. And but fire is a part of our natural ecosystem here, the High Plains and the Pine Ridge. It helps the grasslands by burning away competitor species like trees, of course, and it generally helps replenish the soil with other nutrients. And the Native Americans that lived here, they took advantage of this natural cycle and used it to their own ends. They would burn patches of prairie to attract green shoots that would bring the buffalo in. When Europeans settled out here, of course, that all changed. Unlike the Native Americans that lived nomadic lives on the prairies, we're a settled society, and so we can't just pack up and move every time fire comes. We have to protect certain parts of land, which means fire suppression. This has had problems. This has had implications for the ecology of the area, as we've allowed undergrowth and underbrush to build up over many years, causing megafires. Climate change certainly hasn't helped. But in any case, we're going to look at the most recent such megafire, which happened in 2012. It was called the Region 23 Complex in Wellnitz Fire. And we're going to look at every aspect of it. We're going to look at the history of the region, the firefighters' efforts, the way the community responded, and how they plan to make it not happen again. But anyway, we're going to start off with a review of the fire history of this area.
And the first thing we're going to look at is this broader context, previous fires in the region.
Stormy weather, like a bad romance. Stormy weather, don't give you a chance. Thunder and lightning, hail and snow, wow, those stormy winds.
Before 2012, major fires have hit the Nebraska panhandle in southwestern South Dakota in 1960, 1989, 2000, and 2006, not counting a smattering of smaller ones.
Can set you down. Stormy weather, been hitting this town too long.
A lot of the people who grew up in this region grew up alongside fire, especially if they were ranchers. The Nebraska Panhandle isn't exceptional in this regard. Other rural areas of the American West have similar experiences, attitudes, and responses to fire.
Till those stormy clouds roll away. And you're loud talking, ain't loud around.
I originally grew up in Harrison. It's about 50 miles west of here. My dad has a cattle ranch up there, kind of in the Pine Hills. Right after I went to Marine Corps boot camp, there was a fire that went through my dad's ranch. It was the Thayer fire in 2006. It's the same one that got Sea Hill here.
Okay.
Same summer, around about the exact same time. And that was kind of depressing, getting that letter in the mail.
Oh, yeah.
After I got out of the Marines, it was that first summer that I was back, I think, or second summer that I was back. There was a fire out on Cottonwood Road, and I can't remember whose property it was, but my dad came into town and got me, and I went out to go and help because it was our neighbors.
I grew up south of Hay Springs on a ranch.
Okay.
Yeah, and actually lived there my whole life. Went to high school in Hay Springs, came to college here at Chatham State College. Went 3 years, and then I got married, moved back down to our ranch. Of course, we lived on more in the plains and the grasslands, not trees. And in the summertime, that wildfire, especially when it was dry, was always a threat. And we did specific things to be ready to fight wildfire. We bought it's a harrow, that is small enough that you can fold it up and throw it in the back of a pickup and then pull it with a pickup. And so you could make a bit of a fire break with it. And we always kept 50-gallon, 30-gallon barrels full of water with gunny sacks in our shop, so we could throw them in the back of the pickup, and always had shovels and stuff ready, and wet gunny sacks and that harrow so that we could go fight fire.
Did you ever have to use it?
Oh yes, yeah, many times. Yeah, I didn't personally fight fire on our ranch, but my dad went to where there were fires lots of times, and once we had a lightning strike which started some haystacks on fire in our meadow, so we fought those. And actually the fire department came for that one because it was a big haystack fire and it wasn't going to go out, so the fire department came to that one.
Okay.
Yeah, rural fire departments, and rural fire departments, keep pumper trucks and trucks in areas that they've designated in the country so that they can get to a fire more quickly. Because if you had to wait for it to come sometimes from the city, it would take a long time to get there. It could be long enough that it wouldn't be, it could burn things down.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Okay. So
I remember my dad coming back. Sorry.
Oh,
and
no,
and
please.
all of his eyebrows were burned off, and all of his arms were all, and he was all black because, it was hand and shovel fighting of the fire.
I remember growing up, my dad had a ranch just outside of Hay Springs that the railroad would come through, and a lot of times during the summer when it would get really hot and dry, we'd have, every once in a while, would have a prairie fire out there because of the trains coming through. Every once in a while would start a fire just because of the engines or whatnot would spark, but outside of that, no.
How did you fight those little prairie fires caused by the trains?
Generally what they would do a lot of times is the railroad itself, that was back in the day when railroads were required to have cabooses, and the conductor, whoever was in the caboose, a lot of times would, by the time the end of the train went by, would see the fire, they'd call it in, and then the local fire department, like from where my dad lived down at Hay Springs, would respond, and then they'd come through and fight the fires that way usually. The only one I can think of that got real big was that we had a fire that grew. It was probably a good mile and a half in diameter once it finally got put out. It was one that really got out of control, that they had multiple agencies fighting. I didn't have a lot to do with it. I was only about 8 or 9 at the time, but I remember, seeing all the fire trucks come through my dad's place and all the smoke and stuff from it.
I'm not from Nebraska, I'm from Wyoming, up in like Wellnitz and Cody, Yellowstone, the northern part of the state near Montana. One of my friends was a volunteer firefighter, so I've got plenty of war stories from him. There was one time I was up at Red Cliff Bible Camp. My parents had enrolled me, and we had to leave 3 weeks early because of the fire up on the mountain was getting too close.
And this was all back in Wyoming?
Yeah, this was all back in Wyoming. The fires here, I saw the smoke and the sun was always red, so by that time, it was all kind of commonplace. It's like, oh, another fire. I guess this is one of the, California has earthquakes and volcanoes, we get fires.
All right, these fires out in Wyoming, can you tell me any more about them?
They were usually really big. Like, they would have to fight fire with fire instead of going in with helicopters.
Having taken a look at local fire history, let's examine more closely how the fire was actually fought in 2012.
My dad lives on Norweska Road, which is where the fire line was drawn at, and unfortunately I can't tell his story. I've heard bits and pieces. He said that you could actually see the flames and the firefighters from his door, and he stayed out watering the place down as much as he could. He's on a well, so he wasn't interfering with the firefighters' water supply.
Well, from what I remember, it was obviously a very dry year, and much in the same way that we had in previous years, especially during 2006, it just seemed like anytime we'd have a small thunderstorm, even a small one, we would get fire somewhere because of lightning, and the lightning would really start a fire rather easy. And from what I remember, we had, we started having multiple fires in and around the area, up in the same area where what they called in 2006 the Robert Tract fire. We started having fire over there starting, and I can remember probably the first night that I can remember of the 2012 fires was when they actually started the evacuation process for people out here south of town. That was what I remember when I really became involved, because obviously when we have evacuations going on, we get inundated with a lot of calls and radio traffic in the 911 centers. So I remember going in that night, helping the other dispatcher who was on duty answering phone calls. We also were doing what we could to get the word of the evacuations out. We called the weather service. They issued like an alert, much the same way they do when a severe thunderstorm is in the area, but just advising people, if you live in this area, you need to evacuate. So that's what I remember, at least when it first started, was helping with a lot of the evacuation notices and taking phone calls, passing information on, and then dispatching information onto the firemen that we had out there then fighting the fires. As the fires went on back then, as they kind of went on and grew, we didn't see as much activity or traffic in the 911 center other than just being there to field calls, because as the fires grew, we got more and more firefighters from outside the area in. Then we had like FEMA moving in with their incident management teams coming in, taking control basically of the whole situation. They even brought their own communication system and equipment and people in, and basically ran the fire from the field. Then our role was mainly a supportive role, mainly to just again to provide information to the public in times of emergency. I have found in my job that the public goes with what they know. Even though the fire command had their own phone line, encouraged people to call them for up-to-date information, the public by and large still called us because we were the most familiar source of information to them, so they still called us. So it was it was important to us to make sure we were keeping the line of communication open with the command center that they had established in Crawford, so that we had the most up-to-date information, especially when more evacuation notices came out. We made sure we were on top of that to be able to tell people about the evacuations and where they needed to go.
We were waiting there for a little while. We got a call on the radio. They were looking for the fire chief from Harrison, and he had gone home to go and catch a couple hours of sleep. So we went over to where this guy was calling us for, and he said, "What's your plan for whenever it jumps the road?" And we only had 2 trucks with us, and we were just kind of waiting. And it was about a mile and a half off, and we thought nothing of it. But as soon as the sun started coming up, the wind changed, and it started coming towards us pretty quick. And we tried to lay down some wet lines, and that fire got right up to the road, and it started jumping over us. And I was spraying on the edge of the truck. I had a flame-proof, what they call a baklava, and it goes over the top of your head. But that was hot. My face was hot. I was singeing all the hair off and everything else like that. And at that point, I stopped caring about trying to get the fire put out, and I just kind of turned the hose on myself and hoped that I wouldn't burn. But luckily, the guy that was driving the truck that I was on the back of kept driving through it, and we got up the road a little ways. And there was a rancher with a tractor that had a plow on the back of it, and he was cutting a bunch of lines, and he kind of went back up the road and came around and started cutting an edge. So we went back down the road after it burned across, because once it's burned, there's no more fire left. So we went back down the road and got behind him and just kind of put it out along there. A bunch of other trucks started showing up, and we were all right. I think I've been shot at. I've seen stuff get blown up. I've seen a lot of gnarly things. Nothing compares to that 15 minutes where I thought I was going to get burned up.
I had seen range fire before, and I had seen the fire that came, the fire that came up to town in the previous fire, And this one, it was really interesting to go to the fire meetings and listen to the fire managers, because they said this was like they were the perfect conditions for fire, and fire did not act in a manner that was predictable, considering what happened in this fire, because it was so dry and so hot, and it created conditions that were different. And they learned a lot from this fire, the fire managers and the people that fought it. And I learned how important it is to have resources available close when something like this happened. The fire manager lives in Rapid City, and I spoke to him personally many times, and he was here, and then he actually has a gallery in Rapid City. But he said he had fought fire his whole life, and he had come from California, and he made some calls which got that great big tanker. There was a great big huge water tanker flew here from California, and when the fire was still on the west side and it was coming to town, and on the radio it said be ready to evacuate, they brought that big tanker in, and the fire manager said if they had not had that, the fire would have jumped the highway and it would have come to town. And he said they could not have stopped it. And he said I'd never want to have to fight that again. He said that one was so very close to coming to town, to jumping the highway. If it hadn't been for that big tanker, it would have.
Regrettably, there were other fires going on in Colorado, Nebraska, because the drought was kind of all over the place. So when ours hit, there wasn't much we could do to respond. And had there been something, perhaps the fires could have been put out much more rapidly and wouldn't have been so devastating. Because when they finally got the planes to come over and start dropping things to put the fire out, it worked, and worked quite rapidly. But it took a long time for those resources to be freed up.
Yeah, one friend kind of humorously told me that his house was about a Tim Tebow football throw away from the fire.
John Decker, right?
No, that would be our friend John. Yeah, and it did come quite close to his house. You know, driving down the lane to get to his house, you would notice one side of the plains were just completely scorched and blackened, while the other side was all right.
Did you see the firefighters at their work or anything like that, or?
Yeah, he did. I guess they chose to fight that on the road right in front of his house, and that's where they ended up stopping it. But I guess for them it was fairly tense because they had to go across the lake. The lake sits right behind them, which kind of separates them from the town of Oglala, and over in the town of Oglala, across from the lake, they were just watching the whole time, just as the wall of flame came down, and you know, wondering if their houses were going to be spared. Also had another friend, John Littlefinger. He has a trailer kind of on that side of the lake, and said he didn't really know what to do, so he just got out and played his banjo. I guess he wanted to recreate Narrow's thing that he did during the fall of Rome.
As with any big disaster, there's a larger bureaucracy that handles sufficiently large wildfires. Let's see how that played out in the Nebraska Panhandle in 2012.
Really interesting. Just knowing how the town hung on this one slender thread. And if it wasn't for this fellow's connections, I mean, it might have turned out.
I believe part of it was his connection and his experience fighting fire, and they knew that if they couldn't get something here that could have a huge impact, they couldn't have stopped it by hand. And he just said that. He said, and he actually lost some of his crew were some of the young people that, several years ago up in the Black Hills, several firefighters perished, and those were his people. And he said, I'm never going to have that happen again.
I think by and large, you know, again, everything worked well for the most part. There were better lines of communication. I know in the 2012 fires in 06, because in 06, You know, there were some miscommunications back then. During the height of the evacuations in '06, we didn't even know where that command post had moved to. Nobody even passed that on to us for several hours. It wasn't until way early into the morning hours that we were notified that the command post was up on the north end of town at the Forest Service. They originally had been up at the college, but when they started evacuating, they of course had to evacuate, but there was a lot of confusion. 2012, we didn't seem to have as much of that confusion. There was a lot better communications between everybody. In my own line, working with radio communications, their radio people communicated a lot better with us. There was a lot better sharing of information, of equipment, radio resources. They utilized our radio system and would keep us informed of different things, and it was really helpful. So I would say that that again we learned quite a bit from that. Like I said, the only thing I can say is there's always going to be a bit of a miscommunication on a few things once in a while, but by and large, I really can't think of anything that really stands out as far as anything that really went wrong, with the 2012 fires.
If there's anything I would change about how it was handled would be with the Pine Ridge Fire Department and departments in Nebraska. There was a lot of red tape there where the Pine Ridge Fire Department actually wanted to come in and stop the fire before it crossed the border into the reservation, but were told they couldn't do so. Even if they could have just got the go-ahead to come into Nebraska and fight it there. Well, no one else was fighting it, like all the other crews were understandably elsewhere, but if they just would have let the Pine Ridge crew come in and stop it before it came into the reservation, the thing wouldn't have spread as much.
Interesting. So tell me more about this red tape. Do you think there's any underlying causes for it?
Just hostilities that are always kind of there between the communities, perhaps. That's what a lot of people I talked to just chalked it up as. There's always a perpetual jurisdiction war that goes on between the reservation and the surrounding communities, and I think maybe the firefighting ended up as sort of a chip in that whole battle.
That's really interesting to hear because what I hear from most of my other sources is that the fire brings people together, and here in this case it's actually a cleavage pushing people apart.
Yeah, it was just because of how it was handled. If on the Nebraska side they would have let the Pine Ridge fire crew come in, yeah, a lot of needless destruction, especially on the reservation side, could have probably been spared. But since they had to deal with the red tape of they couldn't fight this fire before it came across reservation lines, well, it ended up being a bigger catastrophe than it needed to be. Yeah, if they could have went out and fought the fire there and dug their lines and dealt with it on the Nebraska side, because they could see it coming, they could tell it was going to come that direction of the reservation. So yeah, if it could have been dealt with, if they could have just got the go-ahead to go into Nebraska and do their thing there, yeah, it would have lessened probably the magnitude of it.
I didn't really start dealing with the federal government until after we were out there. The second day was whenever we really started running into the hotshot crews and stuff, and then the third day was whenever I checked in at Crawford. So I think they did a good job. There's a lot of oversight, and they were wanting things done a specific way, but that's just kind of how the larger you get. I was used to that stuff because of the military, but the local guys weren't.
Sure. Well, there was a philosophical difference between the hotshot crews and the local guys.
Somewhat. It wasn't so much that. There was a handful of guys who were in charge, and they thought that they could come in and just start telling us what to do. But we were there to look out for the landowner. We weren't there to look out for Forest Service land or anything else like that.
Sure, and that was their mission, of course.
Even if you're not out fighting a wildfire, there's plenty for the community to do to help. Firefighters need to be housed and fed, supplies and traffic must be coordinated, and emergency plans need to be drawn up, possibly to evacuate thousands of people long term. Oftentimes, this all must be done with not enough government funding to pay for it all, requiring volunteers and donations. So how did the community help the firefighters in 2012?
Whenever we went down to Crawford, there was a bunch of volunteers that were making us breakfast. Even on the Wellnitz fire and stuff like that, people would come out and bring us breakfast burritos, and a couple of times maybe a beer or two. But that was pretty.
Yeah, wasn't
pretty
the Sioux County Fair going on around that time?
Yeah, the Wellnitz fire. That one was awful because we'd gone out there about a week before, and I was on a 5-ton with one of the surplus Army 5-tons we bought them, and then threw some tanks on the back of them. And I went down with Jim Ellicott. He was former fire chief up there at Harrison, and we went down there and just kind of sat and watched, and it was kind of bunk. We emptied out our tank into a bunch of little trucks and things like that, but we weren't really doing much with the tanker. And so we just kind of hung out there, and supposedly they had it contained, but about 4 or 5 days later, it was the Sioux County Fair. And if you go to a fair in Sioux County, all you're going to see is a bunch of cowboys and some fire trucks maybe, and for the parade and everything else like that. So that year there was no fire trucks in the parade. They were all back down in Crawford. And after the parade, I ran into one of the dispatchers there, and she said, "We need some people to go and relieve the night crew." And I was pretty bummed out because I had high intentions of going out and drinking that night, and that was kind of a cramp on my plans.
Oh gosh, we're so lucky. I think we are so lucky to have the people that we have here. My word, they sacrificed their lives. They fought and fought and fought and fought. That's another thing we did, is which made me have a kind of a better appreciation or a better understanding. We got together food and water and drinks and stuff and took it to the fire hall, and there were mounds of things that people had donated for our firefighters. I think they do the very best job they can do. We're lucky, and some of the protection of our homes and our places it's our responsibility. If we build someplace where it's not protectable, well, then that's our responsibility, not theirs. It wouldn't be right for them to risk a firefighter's life to try to save a house someplace that wasn't protected. And that's what they said about Michaela's house. They did the best they could do. They only lost one house in that whole fire. And in the fire before that, how many places did they save between here and the Job Corps? Many houses. Didn't lose. Well, the ones out in Hidden Valley, and that actually was my daughter's maid of honor. Her house burned in that fire.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah. Well, and it wasn't protectable. You have to have trees cleared, and you have to have a place where if a fire trucks get in there, it can get out. And those are personal responsibilities. So, and build with materials that can be as fireproof as possible. Those are our responsibilities. We're so lucky to live here where we do, and have the people that fight these fires, and have the coordination. It's never going to be perfect, but it's not predictable.
By and large, yes. I think, especially in the 2012 fires, I think because we learned a lot from the 2006 fires. We were lucky in 06 back then not to really have any real, or at least any loss of life. While we lost quite a bit of property in that fire too, we learned quite a bit. So when 2012 came along, we learning from some of the mistakes of 06, we knew kind of what needed to be done, just for those of us who were here for that from experience. we kind of knew what needed to be done with the evacuation notices. And the public was a lot more understanding, I guess you could say, because a lot of them that were here for '06, kind of knew, what was going on, or a little more familiar with the practices and knowing why are they evacuating these people, why are they going, why are they having to leave. After seeing the destruction of those 6 fires, they understood that just how powerful and how fast moving these wildfires could be. And so we didn't seem to have as much confusion or panic in the 2012 fires as we did in '06.
Well, what do you appreciate most about the community's response, and what do you wish they had done that they didn't?
I would say it was just their overall support. They had, they gave support to everybody, the firefighters, law enforcement, and there was a recognition of even us in the dispatch center. Not that there wasn't in '06, but I think people after the '06 fires just came to appreciate the job everybody was doing, and overall, the support was overwhelming. They understood how exhausting the hours and long hours a lot was put in, but they were very supportive of really everybody that was involved in some way.
This won't be the last wildfire the Nebraska Panhandle has to deal with. Remember, fire is not only a natural occurrence here, but a key part of the ecosystem. So not only will it happen again, but on some level, we need it to. That said, what are local, state, and federal plans looking like for the next fire?
Oh yeah, out at the Chadron Airport. The tanker didn't show up, but they had a good turnout. They'd installed the new equipment for mixing the slurry that they spray on the fires, and explained that to us. And lots of people that competed to take credit for getting the tanker base here got up and gave speeches. The city manager was here. Our representative, Al Davis, was here.
They got a lot more equipment. I know that J.W. Geyser was talking about. We secured some loans through like or grants and stuff like that. NEMA stepped in, Nebraska Emergency Management. They gave us some money for some stuff. I guess they're in the process of building a new fire hall if they haven't gotten it built already. So like the community really kind of stepped in, and there was people dropping off food and fuel and things like that. Everybody was willing to put in their share, because you got to kind of pay it forward. If your ranch is on fire, you would expect somebody else to do the same.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So there you have it. At the last minute, an aerial tanker flew here from California and saved the town of Chadron from wildfire. As you can see, the community has pitched in and done everything they can, and will probably continue to do so. Incremental improvements are being undertaken by this area despite the purchase of a new aerial tanker. Harrison's getting a new fire hall. Volunteer crews are getting more training. Property owners are being educated on the dangers of wildfire and how they can help. But I think the most important social legacy, at least, was the unity of the town. And I'm going to leave you on one incident that sticks out in my mind, and I'll leave you on that note.
I know a lot of people went up on Sea Hill.
I went up on Sea Hill during this.
Yeah.
I went up there and I tried to take some pictures. At the time I didn't have a very good quality camera, but you could definitely see a glow on the horizon in all of my pictures.
So did you go up at night or during the day?
At nighttime. I don't think I was there in the day at all.
Okay. Were you there when other students were going up?
Just a couple of them. They came up and they just enjoyed the view with me, and we kind of shot the wind about just whatever, college student life while we were watching hell.
The plains and water cannonades, the lusty blaze to bring. The pine ridge is burning, oh she's burning, she's burning. All through the night and day, the pine ridge is burning, oh she's burning, she's burning. All through the night and day, silent we were, we pilgrims as we took the The sky of smoke, it told us to climb the summit. If you can't find him in the burning bush, you'll never see his face. The pine ridge is burning, oh, she's burning. She's burning all through the night and day. The pine ridge is burning, oh, she's burning. She's burning all through the night and day. Upon the mount we tarry till the fires burned within us. The ashes on the flutter were like light to ourselves. The firemen were working, but the increasing glory made blaze again unquenchable. Though the fire quelled, the pine ridge was burning, she was burning.